Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. This is a Currents episode. Currents are shorter and less heavily produced than our full-length episodes and generally focus on a single topic. As always, links to books, articles, and organizations mentioned are available on the episode page at jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is Terry Gaynor. Terry began his law enforcement career as a police officer in the Chicago Police Department and rose through the ranks, spending many years as a homicide detective. He was later appointed director of the Illinois State Police. In 1998, Terry moved to Washington, D.C., where he served as executive assistant chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department. That's the big city police, the main police department in D.C. And 4 years later was selected to be the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police. And from 2007 to 2014, Terry served as the United States Senate Sergeant at Arms. Welcome, Terry.
Jim, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, talk about somebody with a perfect track record and career to talk about the things we're going to talk about here. I couldn't have found anybody with more relevant experience. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on the show.
Well, Jim, I actually like trying to help clarify some of the misconceptions and own up to where we did wrong. But I think transparency and honesty in what we're doing is the way things should be run. So that's my goal.
That's great. And we will dig into some things. And while there may be some criticism of what happened on January 16th up from my part, and maybe yours too, I want to make it clear that I have the highest regard for the police officers and others put in a very difficult situation who did their duty that day. So with that preamble, let's start out with, how did preparations for January 6th differ from preparations that you might have seen or known about for previous potentially volatile demonstrations?
Clearly, we don't have all the answers of what went wrong, and obviously something did. And the Capitol Police, as well as the Metropolitan Police of Washington, D.C., handle a lot of events, big, small, and generally you're handling events where there's the majority of people are law-abiding, even if they're loud, even if they might be perceived as obnoxious. And many have views different from the police officers, and you could have counter demonstrators. So depending on what the gathering is about is how you might decide how to manage it. And you'd be interested in having as much intelligence as you could gather, both electronically and now in this day and age through social media, as well as people living in the community or reading the newspaper, just having a sense of what's going on. And this event, we now know, is much bigger than was anticipated, but it's not nearly the type of activity getting ready for it that we would have been put into the inauguration. And Jim, I do say we a lot as if I'm still doing it. I haven't been up in charge of either of those for the last 5 years, but I stay in close touch with them. I do a lot of work for the Justice Department in troubled, violent cities, so I have a sense of what's going on. So that was a very long answer to say we need to unpack what was known, how the planning procedure would have gone, how you adjust to any plan you have, and how it ended up so bad.
At least superficially, it looked like there was a lot less preparation than I've seen in the past. I mean, going all the way back to the Vietnam War era demonstrations, where I remember seeing on TV the whole Capitol surrounded by bumper-to-bumper metro buses, and then a line of concertina wire, and then National Guardmen behind that, and then the Capitol Police behind them. I mean, clearly it wasn't anywhere near that level of preparation, and even some of the preparations for the Black Lives Matter related demonstrations this summer looked like they were, quite a bit more heavily prepared than they were this time. You think that's a fair statement?
Well, I think it's something that has to be discussed. I mean, if you want to spend some time talking about do law enforcement agencies, the Capitol Police or the Metro Police, anybody else, treat all demonstrations the same and all violent demonstrators the same, then that's a fair conversation to have. But what has happened in this recent one of January 6th is comparing that to the protest in June on the north side of the White House over in Lafayette Park there. Those are two very different things, and people have to remember that the way that was handled by the president and the attorney general and some of the active military, that did not involve the U.S. Capitol Police. It did not involve the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, and all of us would agree that it was mishandled. So that comparing that particular one to January 6th is not a good comparison. But that begs the question: do police treat all violent demonstrators the same? And they should. And we need to examine whether policemen or firemen or military men or people doing pods have any bias they drag with them, that we have to be more careful and watch what they're doing.
And being humans, it's almost certain that they do. The question is it to a disproportionate degree? Well, if we're unclear about the exact differences in preparation, I think one thing that we could posit perhaps a little bit more clearly is there seems to have been a shortcoming in intelligence. Subsequently we've seen that, for instance, the FBI field office in Norfolk wrote a detailed and fairly intense paper warning that there were people preparing for war that were going to be coming to the Capitol. And there was another FBI field office that wasn't quite as dire, but it was pretty dire. And these things were forwarded to headquarters and presumably got to a domestic security component of the FBI. And one wonders, were these things not forwarded to the police? Did the police not pay attention to them? Or did it go to the mayor's office? And, she said, no, we don't want to go there. What are your thoughts on the intel failure that, we now know there were signals all over the internet, most of them in publicly viewable places, that there were a lot of people planning to be there, and that at least a subsection of them were considering serious violence?
Well, those are great questions, and I'm not going to avoid any of it, but I will also say that there has to be a good commission that has the power and the honesty to call balls and strikes about what went wrong. Here's a couple of things I do know. The chief of the Capitol Police, who's now been relieved of his command, is a man that I know and respect. He was once my chief of staff at the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington when he was a young lieutenant, just ready to make captain. And when he was chosen to be the chief of the Capitol Police, I was delighted because of the breadth of his experience in Washington, D.C., heading up the Special Operations Division, responsible for handling all sorts of demonstrations, big and small. And both the men who had distinguished careers with the Secret Service, one was the Senate Sergeant of Arms, one the House Sergeant of Arms, also people I know and have worked with over the years, and all three are very competent. So when this began to unfold, you couldn't help but ask the question, what in the heck happened? And as the reporters were all reporting all day long, all that open information, where they interviewed the protesters, and they talked about how violent they were going to be, and their hatred of what the Democrats had done to the Republicans and to their president. So it is a bit of a mystery. But Chief Sun himself said a week ago Sunday now, or maybe it was last Sunday, said that he didn't have that complete intelligence. In a press conference that I saw with the mayor, she said, and she had the head of the FBI office, Washington, said they didn't have the information. And then it wasn't too far after that, the New York field office of the FBI and the NYPD, the New York police, said they did have it, and they passed it to the Capitol Police. And then, as you mentioned, the information coming from Norfolk would support a notion that they did have it. So clearly, whatever mistakes we thought were cured after 9/11 about eliminating stovepipes and there should be connectivity, there was a breakdown. And there may have very well been a breakdown in the interpretation of that, because even on open source, Jim, there's a lot of garbage and braggadocio and almost stuff that you put in the BS category. But that all has to be carefully vetted and considered. And I don't have the facts as to where those errors were. But I've seen the results of the errors.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, it strikes me that something like the 9/11 Commission would be a good idea to find out how we had this systemic failure. Because a friend of mine said, and I think more or less accurately, that a 15-year-old intern with a Chromebook, give him 2 hours the day before, he could have turned up plenty of stuff to show there was at least a significant chance. And if we consider the stakes, here was Congress doing one of its most solemn, most important ceremonial roles, tabulating the Electoral College and announcing an orderly legal succession between administrations. If there was ever even any reasonable chance of serious violence, there should have been much more in the way of preparation. So it seems like an intel failure for sure, or a judgment failure not to accept the intel.
Well, those are good points. And even whatever planning they did, you have to look at what information do they have to put together the original plan. And then every plan is just a template for how you think things are going to go. In any demonstration, they never go exactly how you think they're going to go. So the other part of all this is adjusting as things unfolded. So I'm relatively confident that a variety of law enforcement agencies and police officers were present in plain clothes, not making themselves known at this demonstration while it was going on. That's perfectly legal. Those are open public events. But the purpose of those to be down there is to share what they're seeing, what they're the tasting in the atmosphere, what are people carrying, and get some on the ground sense of what's going on. So under normal circumstances, the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI would have had a group down there with members from a variety of different agencies, or the Metropolitan Police and the U.S. Capitol Police, and they would have been reporting back so that the commanders up on the Hill could make some determination of what they need to do. And clearly in the command centers, you would have been watching the speeches of members of Congress that were up there, and the president's son, and Mayor Giuliani, all who were using pretty volatile words, and let's go get them, and we've been robbed, and let's attack, let's fight for the truth. So again, it would be reasonable to assume that you would be getting this information, sending it back, and begin the adjustments. And then based on what has been reported by Chief Sun, when that happened, he began the process of asking for control and support by some of the smaller National Guard units that were doing traffic duty and some other things for, I believe, the Metropolitan Police Department. And then you read all the hullabaloo about who can give permission and how to go up the military chain of command. And I think that might be a sideshow, because normally you would not use those citizen soldiers as a quick reaction backup to law enforcement. That what in the planning process, big or small, you'd want to have enough assets available, maybe even out of sight, in case things got bad. But we don't know what happened there. But I think that slowed the process down and did not contribute to trying to have reserve civil disturbance units on hand.
Yeah, I know in the past, for some of the bigger demonstrations, certainly all the way back to the Vietnam War era included, and things subsequently, again, to the issue, you can't call out the citizen soldiers on short notice. They would often activate them and keep them at the D.C. Armory. And then if they needed them, they could rush them to the scene. You're not going to get them to come from home and put on their gear and all that. So again, another failure of reducing the reaction time in the fact that somebody along the line didn't evaluate properly the seriousness of this event. Another question I think you would be perfect to provide some light on. In reading the press and listening to the, NPR and what have you, there's been more than a couple of comments that one of the problems that Chief Sund faced was the chain of command problem on Capitol Hill itself. He reports, as I understand it, to the two sergeants of arms of the House and the Senate, and then for certain decisions, that has to go either to the chairman of the House Administration Committee or for other things to the congressional leadership itself for a decision. How much autonomy did Chief Sund have on that day to take action, such as calling for Metropolitan Police reinforcements or converting the status of the National Guard from unarmed traffic folks to armed security people?
Well, he would have little to no direct authority to convert National Guard personnel whose mission and assignment was unarmed traffic enforcement and other supplies they might bring. So that would require running through some channels, both in the military district of Washington and then up through the Pentagon. So he would have very, very, very little leeway in doing that. But the command and control and the hiring authority for the chief is the police board, where I once sat after I had been chief. I actually went up and replaced my boss when he retired, and a new administration came in and brought me in. And it's an imperfect oversight, but it's probably not much different than city police departments or state police, which I serve, where the chief of police reports to the city administrator or the mayor or the city council as a whole or some subcommittees of that. So, as the saying goes, almost everybody has a boss in between what the citizens want and what the police chief may have. So as a plan was being developed, the chief would have been interacting ongoing with the board, specifically the House and Senate Sergeant of Arms, letting them know how the planning is going, and they can weigh in on that. Again, they're up there, part of beyond just the protocol and some of the other duties that they have to help with continuity of government and continuity of operations in overseeing the police department. So taking Steve at his word, as I would, because I respect him for that he asked permission to have National Guard called out up on the Hill, and as he reported, he didn't get that. So they're going to have to, both the Sergeant of Arms are going to have to answer is why they didn't agree with Steve's assessment that more people were needed. But one of the problems now in the public discussion of that is the use of the term optics, for someone to say, oh, they didn't want the optics. And now we ought to get into a little discussion about what optics means in that the way it's being used. And really what it means is, what is the message that we want to send about the United States and the Capitol and security? And most people, I would say, do not want tanks and Humvees and heavily armed military people patrolling our streets or up on the Capitol Plaza and around the Capitol. So I think that's what they mean about the optics. So what that means, and through my career, especially as I moved up in chain of command, was that if you thought the threat was enough that you wanted more people, meaning your own people, you might go to 12-hour shifts. You might cancel days off. You might not give anybody breaks. But you would also, if you cancel days off, bring people in and standby. So you would have a patrol picture of the way police officers might normally look, with a soft cap or a baseball cap, or the typical thing everybody sees in their city. And if you were worried about things breaking bad, then you would have people in places out of sight but ready to call nearby who would be dressed for battle. And again, we're going to have to figure out, once the chief was told he couldn't have National Guard, then he had to talk with his personnel and decide, okay, they're not giving me permission to do that, which is their right. Then what's my workaround? And I think there could have been some workarounds based on my experience, although my immediate experience up there is 5 years old. That the working relationship between the Metropolitan Police Department, the Council of Government, who manages cooperation pacts with all the police departments in the area, as well as in Virginia and Maryland, especially in Arlington and Fairfax County and PG County. Those are all preset and very easy to exercise, and are exercised in an emergency or the State of the Union or the inauguration. So it is incumbent upon the chief, ultimately, in my opinion, since he has the primary responsibility of command and control of the police officers, to be prepared for the worst. He's the one who would have to make the ultimate decision about he and his staff about what the intel meant. So there's going to be not much shade in a defense that they wouldn't let me do it, or I didn't have enough people. So when you get in those positions, anybody who leads organizations, you either follow the orders or stand up and buck, or you work around them.
Are you aware of what the readiness status of the Capitol Police were that day? Had they canceled leave? Had they double shifted? Had they basically taken those intermediate steps of increasing their readiness?
I don't have the full picture. I do know this, that department, like Metropolitan Police Department or any department, has been somewhat hampered because of the COVID, where 4, 5, 6, 7% of the department might not be available. So I know they were working a lot of forced overtime, but I don't have the specific numbers.
Okay. And you talked earlier about, if they thought the things were going to get tough, they would have put on their battle gear, their black web stuff, maybe their vests. I didn't see much of that. What do you know about their physical state of readiness on that day when the event occurred?
Again, I know how it was being run there in the Capitol Division of the Capitol Police. There's different divisions, House and Senate and Capitol. So those are officers who spend the majority of their 28-day tour or their assignment in the Capitol, so they know it inside and out. They have a large roll call area and lockers in one of the basements, and they would have been issued the type of gear that you would put on in a riot situation. In the past, they certainly were, and that would be down in their locker rooms, which, depending on what floor you are in the Capitol, could be, maybe furthest 4 stories away from where you are. But that, so typically during a joint session like that, inside you would not be wearing those things. And even some of the patrol units right around the outside, you would not be wearing those things. But if you're in a squad car, a police car, you can have that stuff in the trunk and it's easier to grab. Inside, if you had the time and the relief factor, you could send people, in theory, to go gear up and then come back to station. But what the timeline is, we see, it does not appear from the time it went very bad to the breach that they would have had time to do that. But again, Jim, that's the preparation. If you knew the week before or the hours before that was going to happen, then you wouldn't needed to adjust. But I also want to say this about, listen, because I had the responsibility of leading that department and policies and procedures and training and anticipating, as I did the responsibility of the Senate Sergeant at Arms. In all the protocols and operations we had, there was, I don't recall any detailed talk about losing uh, the capital to marauders. In other words, the security operation, which was heavily oriented towards state-sponsored terrorism and incoming aircraft and suicide bombers and suicide people in cars, you did a lot of that. In the concentric rings you have to provide standoff to the capital would not have anticipated. I did not anticipate 5 years ago, or now 15 years ago when I was the chief, that we would have been in a situation where United States citizens would have been so riled up and hateful and been at a meeting by the White House where our leaders, our president would have said, go down and attack. That was not one of the contingencies we planned on when I was there. We didn't envision that. But you are right to say someone with poor sight should have sensed that the hate and discontent that was going on around, building up over 4 years, and the split of America and the way the election was being contested, that maybe the situation should have been, obviously, it wasn't handled right. I don't know what the hell else to say other than I want to know more facts. I want them to improve. We want them never to happen again. But had I been chief or I had been Senate Sergeant of Arms and this had happened, I would not be surprised to be fired. I just wouldn't. I mean, that's the responsibilities and authority that goes along with command.
Yep. Yeah. What I'm trying to dig in here is that it seems like these failures were at multiple levels and multiple times. To go back to your your data, which I did not know, that it's likely that there were police intel folks, either FBI or maybe Metropolitan Police, in the crowd who could start seeing that this is getting a pretty riled up crowd, and presumably they're communicating back to somebody, and even that would have given an hour and a half lead time to the Capitol Police to have geared up, for instance, right, or called in some people from leave, or pulled people in from some of the outlying buildings, but that doesn't seem to anybody have either the intel wasn't forwarded, or it wasn't received, or it wasn't acted upon. So again, it seems like at every time frame, there's a couple of day time frame where the Norfolk office report, there was some deeper time frames that anyone who really understood the internet could have gathered that information, and then there was day of intel and adjustment, as you would call it, that seemed not to have happened. So it's like when any failure diagnosis, a plane crash, a nuclear power plant, it comes back again and again. It's relatively seldom one failure. It's a whole bunch of failures that happened around the same event. And that seems to be the essence of what happened here.
It does. And again, we need a good investigation of that and figure out why that happened. And then, we could get into the speculative things. Would 300 more riot police been enough? Would deadly force have been enough? Was there less than lethal force that should have been more readily available? Those are all questions. But I do want to say this, because there's been criticism and questions that if you look at those pictures on both the east and west front, and for your listeners, they may know how the west front is the side that faces the Washington Monument. The east front is the side that faces the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress. There are scenes there where those steps and the terraces where police pretty quickly lost control of the plaza, then lost control of the steps, then lost control of the landings if you went up the steps, and then eventually lost control of the balcony, which put people next to windows. And there were officers up there with long guns. And some people say, well, why didn't you just open fire? And that would not have been, is not the training, perhaps up until January 6th, of how you would handle people who are trespassing, who are loud, ignorant, and racist. You wouldn't begin shooting them. On the other hand, if you've looked at some of these pictures closely, where you see the terrorists, the anarchists, the raiders fighting and beating police officers and trying to rip their face mask off. And officers from the Metropolitan Police Department talked about how they grabbed his ammunition pouches, how they tried to take his gun, how they tried talking about let's kill him with their own gun. The restraint and the decision making of officers not to begin shooting in a crowded hallway to try to get someone was laudatory. And so the weapons control and when do you shoot and when do you use deadly force was admirable. But it will be reviewed as to what the tactics need to be if we are going to have enemies of our democracy grown in our country who want to do this.
Yeah, it certainly was an eye opener. Now, what about some of the things we've seen in the media that are pretty, at least at a raw look, maybe we were misinterpreting them. There looked like there were some situations where perhaps the police were actually even helping the raiders, where barriers were removed or turned sideways to give passage, and where officers were, taking selfies with the raiders. Obviously, most of the police officers weren't doing that. But what's your sense of, the claims, at least, that a small minority of the police officers, seem to be in almost active collusion with the raiders?
Well, when it was first raised to me, I simply denied it. I said, no, I know those men and women. That can't be possible. And as I examined those, I looked at them and I said, okay, let's go through a couple examples that have been widely talked about. On the East Front, which is over by the Senate stairs, is almost the first place if you're coming onto the plaza from Constitution Avenue. You see hundreds of loud, boisterous people confront maybe 4 or 5 police officers if you take a quick look at it. And there's bicycle fence. And bicycle fence is meant to be just a line, as if you're walking down a street in your city and they're repairing the sidewalk and there would be, orange tape saying sidewalk closed. And a reasonable person then would walk through the wet cement or the hole that had been dug. So bicycle fence has limited value to stop crowds who aren't going to listen to police direction. And so my reaction was that it didn't seem unreasonable to see those 4 or 5 or whether it was 6 officers eventually make the determination that we can't fight 300 people here. So absent using deadly force. So they would move the gate to buy time, as hopefully they were calling on the radio saying where they needed assistance. And the command center, given the amount of cameras up there, would have been looking at everything unfolding. So I at least understand the rationale of that. Or taking a selfie. One of the pictures I saw was an officer in an area of the Capitol that I know pretty well, because you can tell by you just know the building and the walls and the pictures, is in the midst of what best was he alone, with where you couldn't move anyway, but run into or surrounded by protesters. The fact that he was standing there in the midst of a photo being taken, and it either appears or was a selfie, that could easily be trying to de-escalate some of these things, and them not be in a position to, again, draw his gun and say, everybody stand back. The same way the initial misinterpretation of an officer whose name we now know, Officer Goodman, who was seen in several different photos being chased by a crowd, and he led them up the steps. Well, we now know that Officer Goodman was leading the offenders away from an entrance that would have got him into the chamber quicker. So it is the picture was letting people interpret the picture is. But now, having said that, We already know that the FBI and other agents, along with the Capitol Police and all sorts of agents around the United States, has began rounding up the people whose pictures we could identify. And some of those have turned out to be active policemen, active firemen, retired policemen, retired military people, active military people. So that, that's a problem. If police have a problem gaining the trust of people we serve, people of color, uh, we now have a problem with there could be police and firemen and military people whose loyalty we have to question and their stance to the Constitution. So I'm not trying to overdefend. It would appear that there was some collusion with people who shouldn't have been doing that. And there's allegations now that members of Congress the day before brought people in and escorted them around the Congress, around hallways and near offices where they should not have been doing that. But we need the facts of those things. And if anybody I know who's sworn an oath to a Constitution who was aiding and abetting this should feel the heavy consequences of justice. But I know I'm going on, and I should take more questions. But I want you to also, you mentioned this. Take a look at the pictures of the hand-to-hand combat that those officers from both departments were doing in multiple areas.
Yep, it was a tough situation. There's no doubt about it. On the other hand, as you say, the idea of our sworn officers defecting to a seditious mob is, stomach wrenching. So we certainly need to not make any preliminary accusations without evidence. But I certainly hope this is investigated with a fine-tooth comb to make sure we don't have, seditious action on the part of the sworn officers on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, Jim, listen, in the police departments around the country, the fire departments, we hire from the community. And the community represents people with all their strengths and weaknesses and prejudice and bias and political background. So, the terms everybody was using when there was some police misconduct or less misconduct, whether it was Minneapolis, it must be a few bad apples. And so what we have to figure out is how many terrible, seditious apples we have in these key jobs and how many terrible, seditious murderers that we have in the populace. Someone who would take a United States American flag and beat and drag a policeman down the steps. We've got some problems. We've got some healings to do, and not to get overly involved in the politics. Whether it was 75 million for the president-elect or 72 million for the current president, that's a pretty big damn divide. And not on, which does not mean 72 million people who voted for President Trump's are seditionists. Absolutely not. But apparently there's too many haters in too many places in our lives that we don't need that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, when the head man himself starts mouthing off that way, it's a very bad situation. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about this kind of the atmospherics. I've worked in bureaucracies on occasion in my career. I tried to avoid it, but sometimes I did. And we all know, as you said, everybody's got a boss. The fact that these people were the friends and allies of the boss man himself, the big Cheeto, what effect do you think that had on the whole top to bottom decision making? Are they thinking, heck, these are conservative white folks, they're not going to beat up on the police, or hey, Trump man is our boss 9 levels up, we probably ought not act as if his supporters are a criminal mob. How much do you think thinking of that sort came into these failures that day?
I don't know, and I hope not much, but I also know that extremists on the left and extremists on the right, what brings us to this point. And I'd probably agree that I'll bet policemen as a whole are more conservative than not. Prosecutors as a whole are more conservative than not. Public defenders and maybe a lot of the press are more liberal than not. But I think you can be a conservative or a liberal in any one of those professions, um, and not be patriotic and not support democracy. So it may have influenced someone on onesies and twosies, um, but again, I've seen those police officers do what they're supposed to do, irrespective of the person's color or background or religious or sexual orientation. But I've also seen where that's made mistakes by a lot of different groups and professions across America. So, that kind of gets back into the healing and which way America, which way are we going to go? What are the things we want our children to understand? Um, so there's a lot of work, and I listen. I've worked for Democrats and I've worked for Republicans. Um, I don't recall when I've policed any large events, and I have. My first assignment as a young policeman was the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Then we had the Days of Rage, and then I went on the military and went over to Vietnam and came home. When I went on these jobs, no one asked me what my politics were. They didn't ask me what my religion was or what my sexual orientation was. So I think we can live together without getting caught up on areas we can't get agree on. And now I sound like a preacher, and I'm a subject matter expert in law enforcement, so I'm not a preacher. But I am.
Well,
But I.
a
But I
hopeful
am.
vision.
I
Maybe,
was a three-quarter sociologist.
yeah, that's a hopeful vision, and maybe January 6th was the fever breaking. We can hope so. Now, we've talked about a bunch of negative scenarios and failure modes. One item that keeps coming up in the press is they keep calling out Inspector Grover of the Metropolitan Police as the guy who somehow turned the tide. Have you followed that? And, does he indeed deserve an oversized bit of credit for the work he did that day?
I know Commander Grover. He is a great guy. The new chief of the Metropolitan Police, Chief Conti, was a great guy when I saw him and knew him as a young police officer and a sergeant when I was there. So they are great men. Grover and his response group from the Metropolitan Police Department, the civil disturbance units, did a wonderful job, and I think all those who did a heroic job uh, deserve the recognition. And so they were the cavalry on that day to help the Capitol Police. Along with that, a lot of people who at the moment are nameless. And here's the one major success, the gigantic major success. The fundamental responsibility of the Capitol Police officer is the preservation of life, and then the preservation of democracy, meaning the Senate and House can do their business, and the preservation of the property and the historic value of that. And what ultimately transpired with the help of the men and women from the Metropolitan Police Department and the Secret Service and some other federal agencies is they were able to retake the Capitol. And what a term to use. They retook the Capitol, got all the bandits and the terrorists out of there. And during that time, while that fight was going on, the Capitol Police officers and agents kept every member safe, every staff member safe. Those chambers were not breached while they were doing that. And ultimately, were able, with the assistance again of Secret Service and Metropolitan Police and other agents, with their partners, got the constitutional officers out of there. The number 2, 3, and 4 in succession of the presidency of the United States, got them to a safe place, secured the building, cleared the building of any listening devices, and got them back into their respective chairs so that the constitutional legislative business was fulfilled. That's a very plus. That is the renewed signal sent from that building on a hill. And while I am very sorry that a 130-year-old mirror may have been broken in the speaker's office, and desks were ransacked, and furniture was broken, and feces spread. That wasn't the main business, but they did their job. They exercised restraint after fighting for 3 and 4 hours. And again, put this in perspective. Probably everybody has been, maybe a lot of people have been in fist fights or watch boxing or been in sports. I want you to think through, along as you watch those videos, that these were men and women fighting for, some of them for 90 minutes in a tough situation. So they fought as if their life and the life of the member and democracy was on the line, and it was, and they did their job.
Well, Terry, let's wrap it up there. I think that's a good way to put the whole thing in perspective. It was a vile, stomach-turning thing to see raiders break through the Capitol and do all the bad things you enumerated. But despite a number of failures, which need to be looked into, the line was held, if only barely. So thank you, Terry, for an amazing amount of very serious insight into the events of that day.
Thank you, Jim, and keep America safe. That's what we have to pray for, and, be the change we all desire. So God bless America.
And maybe this will scare us all that the fever will break and that this team red, team blue mentality can be ended.
Yeah, Jim, just one other thing, that whatever percentage of those 8,000 were violent, terrible extremists, others have to take some responsibility for getting mixed up in that and going along with it. So I do understand crowd fever. I don't think all 8,000 were intent on helping murder a Capitol Police officer, but they were there and they shouldn't have been.
And certainly the boss man shouldn't have been cheering them on. So we have a lot to learn as a society, both operationally and intel and preparation and reaction, and we have a lot to learn as a society. So again, thank you very much, Terry Gaynor.
Thank you.
Production services and audio editing by Jared Janes Consulting. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.